Some wounds cut so deep they change the shape of your soul. At 43, Alaina had learned that the cruelest words often come from those who once claimed to love you. Her former betrothed's laughter still rang in her ears from the village square. "Who'd want you now?" The question had settled into her bones like winter cold. She spent her days weaving at her cottage, believing her story was over. But on a misty autumn evening, a stranger emerged from Blackwood Forest. He was tall, cloaked in shadows, with eyes that held the weight of centuries. This man had been searching for her across lifetimes, and he carried a truth that would change everything. Alaina was not unwanted. She was claimed by something far more powerful than any mortal man. What happens when the woman everyone dismissed discovers she belongs to an immortal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the diamond-paned windows of Alaina's cottage, like honey through cheesecloth, casting warm, amber patterns across the worn wooden floors her grandmother had polished smooth with decades of careful tending. The cottage sat at the edge of Thornwick village, where the cobblestone streets gave way to wildflower meadows, and the ancient Blackwood Forest loomed like a sleeping giant on the horizon. It was a place caught between worlds, the familiar comfort of village life, and the untamed mystery of the wilderness beyond. Alaina's hands moved with practiced rhythm across the wooden frame of her grandmother's loom, the silver wedding ring on her left hand catching the light with each pass of the shuttle. The ring felt heavier these days, a constant reminder of Thomas, her beloved husband, who had been taken by fever 3 winters past. She still wore it, unable to bring herself to remove the symbol of their 7 years together. 7 years that had been cut short, just when they were beginning to speak of children, of growing old together in this very cottage where 4 generations of her family had lived and loved and passed into memory. The loom itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, carved from heartwood oak by her great-grandfather's hands. Its frame bore intricate Celtic knotwork that seemed to flow and shift in the changing light, patterns that told stories older than the village itself. Her grandmother had taught her the ancient symbols hidden within the weaving, protection wards, blessing marks, patterns that were said to hold power for those who knew how to read them. Alaina had always assumed these were merely pretty superstitions, charming folklore from a simpler time. The tapestry taking shape beneath her fingers depicted the 4 seasons of Thornwick, each corner representing the cycle of life in their small corner of the world. Spring's corner bloomed with apple blossoms and new lambs, while summer glowed with golden wheat and children playing in the market square. Autumn brought the harvest festival and the turning of leaves, and winter settled over the scene with soft snow and warm hearths. It was commissioned work from the village council, intended to hang in the new meeting hall, and it would feed her for the next 3 months if she could complete it before the harvest festival. The rhythmic thock-thock-thock of the loom filled the silence of the cottage, a comforting sound that had been the heartbeat of her days since Thomas's death. In the early morning hours, before the village stirred to life, it was just her and the threads and the memories that lived in every corner of this place. The rocking chair where her grandmother had told stories of ancient kings and mystical forests. The kitchen hearth where her mother had taught her to bake bread that could make the whole cottage smell like heaven. The bedroom window seat where she and Thomas had planned their future on starlit nights. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Alaina set down her shuttle and smoothed her woolen skirt, a simple brown dress that had seen better days, but still held together well enough for a widow's needs. She opened the heavy oak door to find Millicent, the the baker's wife, holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The older woman's face was flushed from her morning's work, flour dusting her greying hair like early snow. "Good morning, dear one," Millicent said, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her a surrogate mother to half the village's orphans and widows. "I've brought you some of those honey rolls you fancy, fresh from the oven, and perhaps a bit of gossip to go with your morning tea." Alaina stepped aside to welcome her friend into the cottage. Millicent had been her anchor these past 3 years, appearing at her door whenever the loneliness grew too heavy, always bearing food and conversation in equal measure. The woman possessed an uncanny ability to sense when Alaina was struggling with the weight of her solitude. "You're too kind, Millicent," Alaina said, filling the kettle from the well bucket by the door. "Though I suspect this visit isn't entirely about my welfare. You have that look in your eyes, the one that means someone's been talking in the market square." Millicent settled herself into the chair by the hearth, her basket resting in her lap like a sleeping cat. "Well, since you mention it, there has been quite a bit of chatter this morning. Young Henrik, you know, the blacksmith's apprentice, he's been telling anyone who'll listen about strange lights in Blackwood Forest last night. Says he saw them dancing between the trees like will-o'-the-wisps, only brighter and more purposeful. Henrik has an imagination that runs away with him sometimes," Alaina replied, though she felt a curious flutter in her chest at the mention of the forest. She had always been drawn to those dark woods, despite the village warnings about getting lost among the ancient trees. Perhaps it was just travelers with lanterns, passing through on the old deer paths. That's what most folks are saying. But here's the peculiar part. Old Willem the shepherd says his flock was restless all night, huddled together and staring toward the forest like they could sense something moving in the darkness. And you know Willem's sheep. They're usually calm as stones, even when wolves are about. Alaina poured steaming water over the mint leaves in her grandmother's ceramic teapot, watching the green herbs swirl and release their fragrant oils. The cottage filled with the soothing scent, mixing with the lingering smell of fresh bread from Millicent's basket. These simple pleasures, tea with a friend, warm bread, morning conversation, had become the pillars that held up her carefully constructed life. "There's something else," Millicent continued, lowering her voice as if the cottage walls might be listening. "Martha's boy came running into the bakery this morning, white as his mother's washing. Says he saw a stranger on the road just before dawn, tall and cloaked, walking toward the village from the direction of the forest. The boy described him as moving like shadow and moonlight, whatever that means when it comes from a 10-year-old's mouth." The flutter in Alaina's chest became a strange, expectant tension. She set down the teapot with careful precision, focusing on the familiar ritual of serving, rather than the odd stirring in her blood at Millicent's words. "Perhaps it's just a merchant, arrived early for market day, or a traveller seeking lodging at the inn." "Could be," Millicent agreed, though her tone suggested she found this explanation less than satisfying. Still, it's been years since anyone came through Thornwick from the forest direction. Most travellers stick to the main road from Westmere. The old paths through Blackwood have been overgrown for decades. They shared their tea and honey rolls in companionable silence, watching the morning light creep across the cottage floor. Alaina found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the window that faced the forest, as if expecting to see something moving among the distant trees. The sensation was unsettling, a restless energy that seemed to hum beneath her skin like the memory of lightning. After Millicent departed with promises to return soon with news of her daughter's upcoming wedding, Alaina returned to her loom. But concentration proved elusive. Her fingers fumbled with threads that usually obeyed her every command, and she found herself staring out the forest-facing window more often than at her work. The autumn afternoon stretched long and golden, filled with the distant sounds of village life. Children playing in the square, the ring of Henrik's hammer on his master's anvil, the lowing of cattle being brought in from pasture. As evening approached, Alaina lit the oil lamps that would allow her to continue, working into the night. The cottage took on a warm, amber glow that had always comforted her during the lonely hours after sunset. She prepared a simple supper of bread, cheese, and the apple preserve she had made from her own small orchard. The routine was soothing, a familiar pattern that helped quiet the strange restlessness that had plagued her since Millicent's morning visit. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Alaina found herself drawn once more to the window. The forest edge, usually a comforting wall of green and brown, seemed somehow different tonight. The shadows between the trees appeared deeper, more inviting, as if the woodland was calling to something deep within her soul. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching her breath fog the surface in a small, perfect circle. In that moment, standing in the cottage where generations of her family had lived their lives, Alaina felt the weight of her solitude settle over her like a heavy cloak. Thomas had been gone 3 years, but the ache of his absence remained sharp and immediate. Her former betrothed's cruel words from the market square, spoken in jest perhaps, but landing with the weight of truth, had opened old wounds she thought had healed. "Who'd want you now?" The question echoed in the growing darkness, mixing with the whisper of wind through the eaves of her cottage. At 43, past the bloom of youth, widowed and set in her solitary ways, Alaina had accepted that her chance for love had come and gone with Thomas. She was resigned to growing old alone in this cottage, finding purpose in her weaving and comfort in the friendship of women like Millicent. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight the very air seemed charged with possibility, as if the universe was holding its breath in anticipation of some momentous change. Alaina shook her head at her own fanciful thinking and returned to her loom, determined to finish another section of the seasonal tapestry before sleep claimed her. But as she worked, her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from memory, telling stories of ancient magic and destined love that transcended the boundaries of mortal life. Tales of souls that found each other across centuries, bound by threads stronger than death itself. Stories that Alaina had always dismissed as beautiful fiction, designed to comfort hearts broken by loss and longing. Tonight, as the mist began to rise from the meadows and drift toward her cottage like ghostly fingers, those old stories felt less like fantasy and more like prophecy. Something was coming with the darkness. She could feel it in her bones, in the quickening of her pulse, in the way the very air seemed to shimmer with unspoken promises. Alaina set down her shuttle and moved to secure the cottage for the night, checking the heavy wooden door and drawing the thick curtains across the windows. But even as she went through the motions of her evening routine, she knew that sleep would be elusive tonight. The restless energy that had plagued her all day was building to a crescendo, and somewhere in the depths of her soul, a voice that sounded remarkably like her grandmother's was whispering that her true story was only just beginning. The mist that evening moved with unnatural purpose, rolling across the meadows in thick, silvery tendrils that seemed to seek rather than drift. Alaina watched it approach from her kitchen window, mesmerized by its deliberate advance toward her cottage. The fog carried with it the scent of pine and wood smoke, underlaid with something else, something wild and ancient that made her pulse quicken with recognition she couldn't name. She had tried to work at her loom after securing the cottage, but her hands trembled too badly to manage the delicate threads. The restlessness that had plagued her all day had transformed into something more urgent, a drumbeat in her blood that matched the rhythm of her racing heart. 3 times she had risen to check the door bolt, though she couldn't say what she feared, or perhaps hoped, might try to enter. The knock, when it came, was neither urgent nor timid. 3 measured raps against the heavy oak, spaced with the patience of someone who had waited centuries and could wait a few moments more. Alaina's breath caught in her throat, her hand frozen halfway to the door latch. In the silence that followed, she could hear her own heartbeat echoing like thunder in her ears. "I know you're there," came a voice from beyond the door, low and rich as aged wine, carrying an accent she couldn't place, but that stirred something deep in her memory. "I mean you no harm, Alaina. I've come a very long way to speak with you." Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. No one in Thornwick spoke her name with that particular reverence, as if it were a prayer rather than mere identification. Against every instinct of self-preservation, Alaina found her hand moving to the door bolt. "Who are you?" she called through the thick wood, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Someone who has been searching for you longer than you might believe possible," he replied. "Please, I ask only for a few moments of your time. There are things you need to know about yourself, about what you are." What she was. The phrase struck her as oddly phrased, as if he might be speaking of something other than her simple identity as the village weaver. Alaina's fingers hesitated on the bolt. Every sensible part of her mind screamed warnings about opening her door to strangers in the night, especially one who spoke in riddles and moved through mist like something from her grandmother's oldest tales. But beneath the fear lay a deeper current, a bone-deep recognition that made her soul sing with wordless longing. This voice, this presence beyond her door, felt like the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking, like the missing piece of a puzzle she'd carried incomplete her entire life. With hands that shook only slightly, Alaina drew back the bolt and opened the door. The man who stood on her threshold was tall and lean, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, despite a face that appeared no older than 40. He wore a long black cloak that seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it, and beneath it she glimpsed clothing that belonged to no fashion she recognized, rich fabrics cut in styles that spoke of wealth and nobility from a bygone era. But it was his eyes that stole her breath, deep blue-green like the heart of the forest pool where she had played as a child. They held depths that spoke of knowledge accumulated across lifetimes, ancient eyes in an ageless face, studying her with an intensity that should have frightened her but instead filled her with warmth, like recognition coming home. At his throat, barely visible above the high collar of his dark shirt, hung a pendant of deep red stone that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The bloodstone caught the lamplight and threw it back in crimson patterns that danced across his pale skin like living fire. "You're more beautiful than I remembered," he said softly, and the words held such gentle wonder that Alaina's cheeks flushed despite her confusion. "Remembered," she whispered, stepping back to allow him entry without conscious decision. "But we've never met. I would remember. You would, and you will," he said, crossing the threshold with fluid grace. As he passed her, Alaina caught his scent, pine and mist, and something darker, wilder, that made every nerve ending in her body come alive with awareness. "My name is Kaelin, and you, my dear Alaina, are far more than the village weaver you believe yourself to be." He moved through her cottage as if he had been there before, his gaze taking in the loom with its half-finished tapestry, the ancestral portraits on the walls, the kitchen hearth where generations of her family had gathered. There was familiarity in his survey, as if he were greeting old friends, rather than seeing these things for the first time. "Please sit," Alaina managed, gesturing toward the chair by the hearth where Millicent had sat that morning. The normalcy of offering hospitality helped ground her in the face of strangeness that defied explanation. "May I offer you tea, or—" "Nothing, thank you." Caelan settled into the chair with unconscious elegance, his long fingers resting on the worn arms as if they belonged there. "What I have to tell you will be difficult enough to accept without the distraction of refreshment." Alaina perched on the edge of her grandmother's rocking chair, her hands twisted together in her lap. The cottage felt different with his presence filling it, smaller, yet somehow more alive, as if his very being brought energy to spaces that had grown stagnant with solitude. "You spoke of things I need to know about myself," Xiuhua said, proud that her voice remained steady. "What could a stranger possibly know about me that I don't know myself?" Caelan's smile was gentle, but tinged with ancient sadness. "You are not what you believe yourself to be, Alaina. Your soul, your essence, is far older than this lifetime. We have met before, in other times, other places, and each time I have lost you to the cruel march of mortal years." The words should have sounded like madness, should have sent her running for the door, screaming for the village constable. Instead, they settled into her consciousness, like puzzle pieces finally finding their proper places. The dreams that had plagued her since childhood, glimpses of other lives, other loves, other deaths, the sense of searching for something she could never name, the feeling that her real life was always just out of reach, waiting to begin. "That's impossible," she said, but even as she spoke the denial, her heart was whispering otherwise. "Is it?" Caelan leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "Have you never felt as if you were living the wrong life? As if somewhere else, someone was waiting for you to remember who you truly are? Have you never looked in a mirror and seen a stranger looking back?" Alaina's breath caught. How could he know about the moments when her own reflection seemed foreign, when she would catch glimpses of other faces in her mirror? Women who looked like her but wore different clothing, different expressions, different lives entirely. "Who are you?" she whispered, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would shatter everything she thought she knew about the world. "I am what your people would call vampire," Caelan said simply, as if announcing he was a blacksmith or a merchant. "I am the first of my kind, cursed with immortality and blessed with the ability to find the one soul that completes mine across every incarnation of her mortal life. Vampire." The word hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and impossible, and undeniably real. Alaina should have laughed, should have dismissed it as the ravings of a madman. Instead, she found herself studying his pale skin, the too perfect symmetry of his features, the way shadows seemed to bend around him, as if light itself deferred to his will. "You're telling me you're—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to something so far beyond the boundaries of her careful, rational world. Immortal. Ancient. Bound by an oath made in blood and starlight to protect and cherish the woman whose soul calls to mine. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, rough with emotion, that spoke of centuries of longing. "I am telling you, Alaina, that you are that woman. That you have been that woman in 12 different lives, and that I have loved you through every one of them." The bloodstone pendant at his throat pulsed brighter as he spoke, its crimson light painting his features in shades of passion and eternity. Alaina felt something deep within her respond to that light, a recognition that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the part of her soul that had always known she was meant for something more than this quiet cottage life. "This is madness," she breathed, even as her body leaned toward him like a flower turning toward the sun. "Yes," Kaelan agreed, his smile holding both tenderness and infinite patience. "The most beautiful kind of madness, the kind that makes life worth living across centuries of searching." Before Alaina could respond, before she could process the enormity of what he was telling her, Kaelan rose from his chair with fluid grace. "I can see this is too much for one evening. I will leave you to think on what I've said. But know this, I will return tomorrow night, and every night after, until you remember what we once were to each other." He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to face her. "One more thing, my beloved. You are in more danger than you know. There are others of my kind who would claim you for their own purposes. Keep close to your cottage after dark, and trust no strangers save me." With that warning hanging in the air like incense, Kaelan slipped through her door and vanished into the mist as if he had never been there at all. Only the lingering scent of pine and wildness and the accelerated beating of her heart proved that the encounter had been real. Alaina sat alone in her cottage, staring at the chair where an immortal being had just declared his eternal love for her. Outside, the mist continued to swirl, but it no longer seemed ominous. Instead, it felt like a promise that her small, careful world was about to become something far larger and more dangerous and infinitely more meaningful than anything she had ever dared to dream. Sleep proved as elusive as morning mist that night. Alaina lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams that had sheltered 4 generations of her family, while Kaelan's words echoed through her mind like church bells calling the faithful to worship. Vampire, immortal, eternal love. Each concept seemed to lodge itself deeper into her consciousness with every repetition, transforming from impossible fiction into something that felt increasingly, inexplicably real. She rose before dawn, her body aching as if she had spent the night wrestling with angels instead of lying motionless beneath her quilted coverlet. The cottage felt different in the grey pre-dawn light, smaller somehow, as if Kaelan's presence had expanded its boundaries, and his departure had left it deflated. Every familiar object seemed charged with new significance. The loom where she wove threads into patterns, the mirror that sometimes showed her glimpses of strangers' faces, the very walls that had contained her quiet life until last night shattered it apart. Her reflection in the wash-basin water showed a woman transformed. Her usually neat brown hair hung loose around her, shoulders in waves that caught the lamplight like spun copper. Her eyes, normally a practical hazel, seemed deeper, more luminous, as if something had awakened behind them during the night. Even her skin appeared to glow with inner radiance that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with recognition finally dawning. The dreams that had plagued her sleep, if the fitful hours could be called sleep, had been vivid beyond anything she had ever experienced. Flashes of other lives, other faces, other deaths played behind her closed eyelids like scenes from a play she had forgotten she once performed in. A woman in medieval robes dying of plague, while a dark-haired man wept over her still form. A Renaissance lady falling from a tower window, her last sight, the anguished face of her immortal lover. A Victorian maiden succumbing to consumption. Her final breath, a whispered promise to find him again. Each vision had been accompanied by the same overwhelming sense of love transcending death, of promises that bound souls across the boundaries of mortal existence. And in every scene, the man had worn the same face, Kaelin's face, marked by grief that accumulated across centuries, but never diminished his devotion. As the sun climbed higher, painting her cottage in shades of gold and amber, Alaina found herself drawn to her grandmother's trunk in the bedroom alcove. The old woman had been the keeper of family stories, the guardian of traditions that stretched back into the mists of time. If anyone would have known about supernatural bloodlines or ancient connections, it would have been her. The trunk's hinges protested with age as Alaina lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay treasures she hadn't examined since her grandmother's death. Embroidered shawls that carried the scent of lavender and memory, leather-bound journals filled with spidery handwriting, and small carved boxes containing buttons and brooches from bygone eras. But at the very bottom, wrapped in faded silk, she found what her instincts had somehow known would be there: a mirror. Not the simple-looking glass that hung above her washstand, but an ornate hand mirror with a silver frame carved in Celtic knotwork that matched the patterns on her loom. The metal was blackened with age, but the glass itself remained clear as mountain water. As Alaina lifted it to catch the morning light, words her grandmother had spoken years ago drifted back to her like whispers from beyond the grave. Some mirrors show more than faces, child. They show souls, but only when the moon is full and the heart is ready to see truth instead of comfort. At the time, Alaina had dismissed the words as the ramblings of an old woman whose mind wandered between past and present like a butterfly in a garden. Now they resonated with new meaning. The mirror felt warm in her hands, almost alive, as if it had been waiting decades for her to finally understand its purpose. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. Alaina quickly rewrapped the mirror and closed the trunk, smoothing her skirts as she hurried to answer the summons. She expected Millicent with fresh bread and morning gossip, or perhaps young Henrik with news of more strange sightings from the forest. Instead, she found Erasmus Blackthorn standing on her threshold. The village elder was a man of perhaps 70 years. Though his exact age remained a mystery, he guarded as jealously as the contents of his private library. Tall and lean, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes the color of winter storms, he commanded respect through presence rather than proclamation. Few villagers sought him out unless they needed mediation of serious disputes or guidance through the most difficult decisions of their lives. "Master Blackthorn," Alaina said, offering a respectful curtsy, "what brings you to my cottage this early morning?" "May I enter, child?" His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to obedience, but beneath it lay an undertone of urgency that made Alaina's pulse quicken. "There are matters we must discuss that are not suited for public hearing." She stepped aside, gesturing him toward the chair by the hearth. As he settled his long frame into the seat so recently occupied by Kaelin, Alaina noticed he carried with him a leather satchel that bulged with the weight of significant contents. "You had a visitor last night," he said without preamble, his storm-grey eyes studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "A visitor whose coming has been prophesied for generations." Alaina's hands stilled on the tea kettle she had been reaching for. "I'm not sure what you mean, Master Blackthorn." "Peace, child. I am not here to judge or condemn. I am here because it is my duty, a duty passed down through my bloodline, just as your own gifts have been passed down through yours." He opened the leather satchel and withdrew a book bound in midnight black leather, its cover adorned with symbols that hurt to look at directly. This grimoire has been in my family's keeping for 400 years, waiting for the night when the first one would return to claim his eternal bride. The ancient grimoire seemed to pulse with dark energy as it rested on Erasmus's knees. Alaina found herself drawn toward it, despite every instinct screaming warnings about the dangers of delving too deep into matters beyond mortal understanding. "The first one," she whispered, though she already knew the answer. "Kaelin of the Northern Reaches, first vampire, bound by blood magic to the soul that reincarnates in your bloodline." Erasmus opened the book carefully, revealing pages covered in text, written in languages that predated any she recognized. Your grandmother knew, as her grandmother before her knew. They were the guardians of this knowledge, waiting for the time when you would need it. The pages he turned showed illustrations that made Alaina's breath catch in her throat. Images of the cottage she lived in, drawn in precise detail centuries before it should have existed in any book. Pictures of women who bore her face but wore clothing from different eras, always accompanied by a tall, dark-haired man whose eyes held the weight of eternity. "This is impossible," she breathed, even as the evidence mounted before her eyes. "Is it?" Erasmus asked gently. "Have you never wondered why your bloodline has produced only daughters for 7 generations? Why each woman in your family has possessed unusual longevity and the ability to weave patterns that seem to move with life of their own? Why you have always felt as if you were waiting for something you could never name?" Each question landed like a perfectly aimed arrow, striking truths she had never allowed herself to examine too closely. Her great-grandmother had lived to be 97, her grandmother to 93. Both remaining sharp and vital until their final days. The women of her line had always been known for their remarkable preservation of youth and their uncanny ability to create textiles that seemed touched by magic. "What am I?" Alaina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are the last of the Moonweaver bloodline," Erasmus replied, turning to a page that showed a woman standing beneath a full moon, threads of silver light flowing from her fingers into a tapestry that depicted the future. Mortal, but touched by ancient magic. Born to be the perfect complement to immortal power. Your souls were bound by forces older than Christianity, older than the Roman Empire, older than written history itself. He closed the grimoire gently and returned it to his satchel. "Your grandmother asked me to give you this when the time came." From the bag's depths, he withdrew a small wooden box carved with protective symbols. "She said you would know what to do with the contents when your true nature began to awaken." Alaina accepted the box with trembling hands. It was warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight rather than hidden in darkness for years. The wood was polished smooth by generations of handling, and the protective symbols carved into its surface seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. "There is more you must know," Erasmus continued, his voice growing grave. "The prophecy speaks not only of Kaelin's return, but of others who will seek to claim you for darker purposes. Ancient enemies who have waited centuries for the chance to corrupt or destroy what he holds most precious. You must be prepared for what is coming." Before Alaina could ask what preparations might be necessary, or how one prepared for supernatural threats that existed beyond the boundaries of normal experience, Erasmus rose from his chair with surprising grace for a man of his years. "Read the contents of your grandmother's gift carefully," he advised, moving toward the door. "And remember, trust your instincts. They will guide you more surely than logic or fear. Your bloodline has survived this long because each woman knew when to fight and when to yield, when to hide, and when to stand revealed. With those cryptic words, the village elder departed, leaving Alaina alone, with a box full of mysteries, and a mind reeling from revelations that transformed everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, and her place in a world suddenly grown vast and dangerous, and filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The carved wooden box sat unopened on Alaina's kitchen table through the long afternoon, its presence as compelling as a heartbeat in the quiet cottage. Every time she approached it, her hands would hover over the smooth lid, trembling with anticipation and fear in equal measure. Whatever lay inside would change everything. She felt this truth in her bones with the same certainty that told her when storms were coming or when the seasons were about to turn. As evening shadows began to lengthen across the meadows, Alaina finally found the courage to lift the lid. Inside, nestled in faded violet silk, lay a mirror unlike any she had ever seen. Not the ornate Celtic piece from her grandmother's trunk, but something far older and more mystical. The mirror's surface was made from what appeared to be polished obsidian, dark as a moonless night, yet perfectly reflective. Its frame was carved from some white material that might have been bone or antler, inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and flow when she wasn't looking directly at them. Beneath the mirror lay a letter in her grandmother's familiar spidery handwriting. The parchment yellowed with age, but the ink still clear and dark. "My dearest granddaughter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the time of awakening has finally come. The mirror of souls has waited in darkness for your touch, just as your immortal beloved has waited in the shadows for your recognition. When the moon reaches its fullness tonight, look into the obsidian surface and remember who you truly are. Remember the love that has transcended death itself and the promises that bind souls across eternity. Do not fear what you will see. It is your truth, and truth, however strange, is always beautiful when born of love." The letter trembled in Alaina's hands as she read the final lines. "Trust in the ancient bond, child. Trust in the man who will come to you with shadows in his cloak and starlight in his eyes. But beware the one who comes after, for not all who claim to love us wish us well. Your devoted grandmother, Ilara Moonweaver." Moonweaver. The surname Erasmus had spoken, the bloodline name that had been hidden beneath generations of married names and careful anonymity. Alaina traced the letters with her fingertip, feeling the weight of heritage settling around her shoulders like a ceremonial cloak. As if summoned by her grandmother's words, a soft knock echoed through the cottage. Alaina's pulse quickened as she recognized the measured rhythm from the night before. She set the mirror carefully aside and moved to answer the door, her steps lighter than they had been since Thomas's death, as if some essential part of her was finally coming home. Caelan stood in the gathering dusk, but tonight he appeared more solid, more present, as if her growing acceptance had somehow anchored him more firmly in her reality. The bloodstone pendant at his throat pulsed with warm crimson light, and his eyes held such tender hope that Alaina's heart constricted with emotion she couldn't name. "You look as if you slept poorly," he said softly, studying the shadows beneath her eyes with concern that spoke of intimate knowledge earned across lifetimes. "Sleep seemed irrelevant after what you told me," Alaina replied, stepping aside to welcome him into the cottage. "I've had visitors today, people who know things about my family, about me, that I never suspected. The keeper of the grimoire came to you." It was not a question. Caelan settled into his chair with fluid grace, his gaze moving to the mirror and letter on the table. "Good. You will need allies in the days to come." "Days to come?" Alaina perched on the edge of her grandmother's rocking chair, her hands twisted together in her lap. "Kaelin, I don't understand what's happening to me. This morning I was a simple widow who wove tapestries for village commissions. Tonight I discover I'm some sort of mystical bloodline guardian with a family history that reads like fairy tales." "Not fairy tales," Kaelin said gently. "Ancient truth, preserved through generations of wise women who understood that some stories are too important to be lost to time." He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "May I show you something that might help you remember?" At her nod, Kaelin extended his hand, palm upward. The skin was pale as moonlight, crossed with faint scars that spoke of battles fought across centuries. But it was what appeared above his palm that made Alaina gasp in wonder. Light began to coalesce in the space above his open hand, swirling and shaping itself into images that moved like living memories. She saw herself, but not herself. A woman with her face, but wearing the rough homespun of a medieval peasant, working in fields beneath an alien sky. The same woman, lying fevered in a crude hut, while a younger version of Kaelin held her hand and whispered promises of finding her again. The images shifted, showing her another life. This time she wore the fine velvets of a merchant's daughter, in what appeared to be Renaissance Italy. She was standing on a balcony overlooking a moonlit garden, reaching toward a figure cloaked in shadows who had climbed the villa walls to reach her. Their fingers touched just as armed men burst through the chamber doors behind her, and she saw herself falling, whether from accident or intent unclear, while Kaelin's anguished cry echoed through the night. More lives flickered past in rapid succession. A Viking shield maiden dying with his name on her lips. A Georgian lady succumbing to fever while he held vigil at her bedside. A frontier woman in America's early days, shot by bandits who had discovered their midnight meetings. In every incarnation, their love burned bright and pure, and in every life, death claimed her before they could find lasting happiness. Each time, Kaelin whispered, his voice rough with accumulated grief, "I swore I would find you again. Each time, I searched through decades of mortal years until your soul called to mine once more. And each time, we had so little time together before fate or circumstance tore you from my arms." Tears streamed down Alaina's cheeks as the images faded, leaving only the memory of love that transcended death itself. How do you bear it? The endless cycle of loss? "Because each reunion proves that love truly is stronger than death," he replied simply. "Because holding you, even for a brief mortal lifetime, is worth a century of searching. Because hope, once kindled in an immortal heart, burns eternal." A sound from outside the cottage made them both freeze, the deliberate snap of a branch underfoot, as if someone were approaching through the darkness with less care for stealth than they should possess. Kaelin was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with predatory grace that reminded Alaina he was far more than the gentleman lover he appeared to be. "He comes sooner than I expected," Kaelin murmured, his hand moving to rest on something concealed beneath his cloak. A weapon, Alaina realized with a chill. Victor has never been patient when he wants something. Victor? The name felt familiar on her tongue, though she was certain she had never heard it before. "My oldest companion and greatest rival," Kaelin replied, his voice carrying centuries of complicated history. "He who shares my curse of immortality, but not my devotion to love over conquest. He has spent the last 3 centuries searching for you, believing that claiming you might break his own eternal loneliness." Before Alaina could process the implications of having 2 immortal beings competing for her soul, a new knock echoed through the cottage. This one was different from Kaelin's measured raps, sharper, more demanding, carrying an undercurrent of barely restrained power that made the very air vibrate with tension. "Do not invite him in," Kaelin said urgently, moving to place himself between Alaina and the door. "Vampires cannot enter a dwelling without invitation, but once given, the protection is lost forever." "Kaelin, my old friend," came a voice from beyond the door, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as intoxicating. "Surely you're not going to hide behind the lady's skirts. Come out and greet me properly, and bring the lovely Alaina with you. I've waited so very long to meet her again." Again, the word sent ice through Alaina's veins as she realized that her supernatural heritage involved not just one immortal lover, but potentially two. And from the tension radiating from Kaelin's form, she suspected that Victor's intentions toward her were far different from the protective devotion that bound her to her dark guardian. The cottage suddenly felt very small and very vulnerable, a fragile shell of mortality caught between forces that had been building toward this moment across centuries of patient maneuvering. Outside, Victor waited with the confidence of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. Inside, Alaina faced the realization that her quiet widow's life had truly ended the moment she opened her door to the supernatural world that had always been waiting to reclaim her. The mirror of souls gleamed on her table like a dark promise, waiting for moonlight to reveal truths that might be more dangerous than the ignorance she had lived with for 43 peaceful, mortal years. The standoff lasted through the long hours until dawn, with Victor's presence lingering beyond the cottage door like a predator testing the boundaries of his cage. Kaelin remained vigilant at the window, his immortal stillness broken only by the occasional tightening of his jaw when Victor's mocking laughter drifted through the night air. Alaina found herself caught between fascination and terror, watching the man she was beginning to love transform into something altogether more dangerous. When the first rays of sunlight finally painted the eastern sky, Victor's presence simply vanished, leaving behind only the memory of his voice and the promise of his return. Kaelin's shoulders relaxed marginally, but the tension in his eyes remained. "He'll be back tonight," he said, turning from the window to face her. "And every night after until he gets what he wants. Victor has never been one to accept defeat gracefully." "What exactly does he want?" Alaina asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You," Kaelin replied simply. "Your soul, your power, your essence bound to his will rather than mine. He believes that claiming you will cure the emptiness that has plagued him since his transformation. He's wrong, but centuries of loneliness have made him desperate enough to convince himself otherwise." As if summoned by their conversation about supernatural bonds, the moonstone amulet that had appeared on her kitchen table during the night began to pulse with soft blue light. Alaina hadn't seen Kaelin place it there, but she suspected it was another gift from her immortal guardian, protection against forces she was only beginning to understand. "What is it?" she asked, approaching the pendant with cautious reverence. "A moonstone blessed by druids when the world was young," Kaelin explained, lifting the amulet with careful hands. "It will shield your mind from vampire influence and help awaken the latent power in your bloodline. But more importantly, it will allow me to sense when you're in danger, no matter how far apart we might be." He moved behind her to fasten the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin with touch that sent electricity racing through her veins. The moment the pendant settled against her throat, Alaina gasped as the world suddenly expanded around her. Colors became more vivid, sounds more distinct, and beneath it all ran a constant hum of energy that seemed to connect her to everything living in the forest and meadows beyond. "I can feel them," she whispered in wonder. "Every bird, every rabbit, every tree. It's like the whole world is singing." "Your awakening has begun," Kaelin said softly, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "The Moonweaver bloodline carries the ability to sense and shape the natural world. In time, you'll learn to weave more than thread and wool. You'll weave the very forces that bind the supernatural realm." The next few nights passed in intensive training that transformed Alaina's understanding of her own capabilities. Under Kaelin's patient guidance, she learned to extend her awareness beyond the cottage walls, feeling for disturbances in the natural harmony that might signal supernatural threats. She practiced drawing energy from the earth itself, channeling it through her hands to create barriers of protection or healing that glowed with silver light. Her loom became a focus for this new power. The threads seemed to respond to her emotions now, weaving themselves into patterns that moved and shifted with life of their own. The seasonal tapestry she had been creating for the village council transformed into something far more significant, a map of supernatural currents that flowed through Thornwick and the surrounding countryside. "Remarkable," Kaelin murmured one evening, studying the tapestry as new patterns emerged beneath her fingers. "You're instinctively creating a protective ward for the entire village. Your grandmother's power never manifested this strongly. Perhaps because she never had reason to fear for her community the way I do now," Alaina replied, feeling the weight of responsibility settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Victor's nightly visits continued, though he never again approached the cottage directly. Instead, he made his presence known through increasingly bold displays of power. Livestock in the village grew restless and spooked. Wells that had run clear for generations began to taste of copper and shadow. Strange mists rose from the forest at all hours, carrying whispers in languages that predated human civilization. The village began to notice the changes, though they attributed them to natural causes or seasonal shifts rather than supernatural influence. Only Millicent seemed to sense that something fundamental had altered in Alaina's nature, commenting on her friend's newfound radiance and the way shadows seemed to bend around her when she walked through the market square. "You look different, dear," Millicent said one afternoon, settling into her usual chair with a basket of fresh bread and a look of motherly concern. "Younger somehow, but also older, if that makes any sense. As if you've remembered something important you'd forgotten." "Perhaps I have," Alaina replied carefully, pouring tea with hands that now glowed faintly with inner light when she was emotional. "Sometimes we discover that we're capable of more than we ever imagined." Young Henrik had begun having nightmares about dark figures stalking through the village streets, and Willem the shepherd reported that his flock refused to graze in the meadows closest to Blackwood Forest. Even the village priest, usually concerned only with earthly matters of sin and redemption, had begun adding extra prayers to his evening services, protective blessings against forces he couldn't name, but somehow sensed gathering in the darkness. Through it all, Alaina's relationship with Kaelin deepened beyond the mystical bond of their supernatural connection. She found herself drawn not just to the immortal lover who had searched for her across centuries, but to the man beneath the legend, thoughtful, patient, carrying the wisdom of ages, but retaining the capacity for wonder that kept his ancient heart young. He told her stories of the world's history as he had lived it, painting word pictures of civilizations that had risen and fallen while he walked among mortals searching for her reincarnated soul. He spoke of art and music and literature with the passion of someone who had watched human creativity bloom and evolve across millennia. And in quiet moments between her training sessions, he showed her the vulnerability that immortality couldn't touch, the fear of losing her again, the weight of centuries spent alone, the courage it took to love something so fragile and temporary. "Do you ever regret it?" Alaina asked one evening as they sat together before her hearth, watching firelight dance across the walls that had become sanctuary for both their mortal and immortal needs. The immortality, the endless searching, the knowledge that love must always end in loss? Kaelin considered her question with the gravity it deserved before answering. "I regret the pain it causes you, lifetime after lifetime. I regret the brevity of our time together and the cruelty of forces that seem determined to keep us apart. But I have never regretted loving you, Alaina. Even when that love has brought me to my knees with grief, it remains the most beautiful experience an immortal heart can hold." His words settled into her soul like rain on thirsty earth, nourishing parts of her that had withered during the lonely years since Thomas's death. But beneath the growing love and the wonder of supernatural awakening, a shadow of unease continued to darken her thoughts. Victor's patience would not last forever, and when it finally broke, she suspected the consequences would ripple far beyond her cottage walls to touch everyone she cared about. Orisish. Moonstone amulet grew warmer against her throat, as if responding to her fears, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible even to her enhanced senses, she could swear she heard the sound of Victor's laughter carried on the night wind, patient, confident, and altogether too close for comfort. The attack came on the 7th night after Victor's first appearance, swift and brutal in its efficiency. Alaina woke to the sound of Millicent's cottage burning, the acrid smell of smoke cutting through her dreams like a blade. Through her window, she could see orange flames licking at the night sky, while villagers ran with buckets from the well, their shouts echoing across the square. "Stay here," Kaelin commanded, already moving toward the door with supernatural speed. "This is meant to draw you out into the open." But Alaina was already reaching for her shawl, her newly awakened senses screaming that Millicent was still trapped inside the burning building. The moonstone amulet at her throat pulsed with urgent heat, confirming what her heart already knew. Her friend was dying while precious seconds ticked away. "I won't let her burn because of me," she said firmly, pushing past Kaelin despite his attempt to block her path. The night air was thick with smoke and ash as Alaina ran toward the fire, her bare feet flying over cobblestones, still warm from the day's sun. The cottage that had been Millicent's home for 40 years was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the stars like desperate fingers. Villagers formed a bucket chain from the well, but their efforts seemed pitifully inadequate against the supernatural fire that burned with colors that belonged to no earthly flame. At the edge of the crowd, she spotted Victor. He stood in the shadows between two buildings, his pale features lit by the hellish glow of his handiwork. When their eyes met across the chaos, he smiled with the satisfaction of a chess master who had just forced his opponent into an impossible move. Save the friend and expose herself to danger, or protect herself while an innocent burned. Either choice served his purposes. Alaina closed her eyes and reached deep into the power that had been awakening within her these past days. The energy of the earth rose to meet her call, flowing up through her feet and spreading through her body like liquid moonlight. When she opened her eyes again, they blazed with silver fire that made Victor's smile falter. She raised her hands toward Millicent's cottage and began to weave. Not with thread and needle, but with forces older than civilization itself. She wove cooling mist from the meadows, pulling it through the night air to wrap around the burning building like a gentle blanket, She wove strength into the cottage's support beams, holding them steady against the supernatural flames that sought to consume more than mere wood and thatch. And she wove protection around Millicent herself, creating a pocket of cool air that would allow the older woman to breathe until rescue could reach her. The villagers gasped as mist began to pour from Alaina's fingers, flowing across the square in defiance of wind and gravity. Where it touched the flames, they hissed and died, leaving behind blackened timbers but no lasting destruction. Within moments, the supernatural fire was reduced to ordinary smoke and ember, leaving the cottage damaged but not destroyed. "Millicent!" Alaina called, rushing toward the building as soon as the flames died back enough to allow entry. She found her friend collapsed near the hearth, overcome by smoke but still breathing. With strength she didn't know she possessed, Alaina lifted the older woman and carried her to safety, her whole body glowing with the power she had channeled. The villagers who witnessed her rescue stood in stunned silence, staring at the woman they thought they knew. Alaina's hair floated around her shoulders, as if moved by an unfelt wind, and her eyes still held flickers of the silver fire that had quenched Victor's supernatural flames. In that moment, there was no hiding what she had become. "Witch!" someone whispered from the back of the crowd. The word rippled through the assembled villagers like a stone thrown into still water. Some crossed themselves and stepped back, while others pressed closer, with expressions of wonder rather than fear. Young Henrik stared at her with the awe of someone witnessing a miracle, while Willem the shepherd nodded slowly, as if this revelation explained mysteries he had long pondered. "Not witch," came Erasmus Blackthorn's voice from the edge of the square. The village elder stepped forward, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the dying embers as he surveyed the scene. "Guardian, the blood of the Moonweavers runs true in this one, just as it did in her grandmother before her." His declaration carried the weight of ultimate authority in village matters, but Alaina could see doubt and fear warring with loyalty in the faces around her. The comfortable illusion of an ordinary world had been shattered, and not everyone would welcome the truth that lay beneath. As the crowd began to disperse, some villagers offering help with Millicent's recovery, while others hurried away with backward glances full of suspicion, Victor materialized beside her, with the casual arrogance of a predator who no longer bothered to hide his nature. "Magnificent," he murmured, his voice carrying easily to her ears, despite the noise around them. "I had hoped your power would manifest dramatically, but this exceeded even my expectations." Up close, Victor was devastatingly handsome in the way that only immortal beings could achieve. His features held the same timeless perfection as Kaelin's, but where her guardian carried warmth and depth, Victor radiated cold calculation. His eyes were the color of winter ice, beautiful and utterly without mercy. "You hurt an innocent woman to force me into the open," Alaina said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "I revealed what you truly are to those who would follow you," Victor corrected, with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Think of it as a gift. Now you no longer need to pretend to be something small and mortal." Before she could respond, Kaelin appeared between them, with violence radiating from every line of his immortal form. "You go too far, old friend. Threatening mortals was never part of our arrangement." "Our arrangement was your fantasy, not mine," Victor replied, circling them both with predatory grace. "You've had 7 centuries to win her freely. Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that the lady might prefer a more direct approach to courtship." The two vampires faced each other in the flickering light of dying embers, and Alaina could feel the weight of their shared history crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Whatever had once bound them as allies had long since curdled into something far more dangerous. "Take her home," Victor said finally, his gaze shifting to include Alaina in his cold smile. "Let her rest and recover from tonight's exertions. But know this, the next time we meet, I will not be so restrained in my methods." He vanished into the shadows as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind only the scent of winter wind and the promise of greater conflicts to come. The walk back to her cottage passed in tense silence, with Kaelan scanning every shadow for signs of further threats. Once inside, he immediately began strengthening the protective wards around the building, his hands weaving patterns of power that made the air shimmer like heat waves. "This can't continue," Alaina said, sinking into her grandmother's rocking chair with bone-deep exhaustion. "He'll keep escalating until innocent people die." "I know," Kaelan replied grimly. "Victor has never shown restraint when he wants something, and what he wants now is to break you to his will, regardless of the cost." Elena's gaze fell on her grandmother's trunk, remembering the feeling that there were still secrets waiting to be discovered among the family heirlooms. With sudden certainty, she moved to kneel beside the old chest, her hands guided by instincts she was learning to trust. At the very bottom, beneath layers of carefully folded fabric and yellowed letters, her fingers found something unexpected. A hidden compartment built into the trunk's base, secured with a lock that opened at her touch, as if it had been waiting decades for her specific magical signature. Inside lay a weapon that took her breath away. The thornwood staff was carved from a single piece of Blackwood heartwood, its surface polished smooth by generations of handling. Runes ran along its length in spiraling patterns that seemed to move in the candlelight, and the crystal mounted at its tip pulsed with inner fire that matched the power awakening in her bloodline. "Your family's heritage runs deeper than I suspected," Kaelan said softly, studying the staff with obvious respect. That weapon was crafted by the first moon weavers, designed specifically to channel and focus supernatural energy. As Alaina lifted the staff from its hiding place, it grew warm in her hands, responding to her touch with vibrations that seemed to resonate in her very bones. For the first time since Victor's threats began, she felt truly equipped to face whatever darkness was gathering around her peaceful village. The weapon of her ancestors had waited in darkness for her need, just as her immortal love had waited across centuries for her awakening. Now, with power flowing through her veins and purpose burning in her heart, Alaina finally understood what it meant to be the last of the Moonweaver bloodline. The final confrontation was coming, and she would meet it armed with weapons forged by love and tempered by the wisdom of generations. The soul-binding scroll appeared 3 nights later, delivered not by Victor or Kaelan, but by forces far older than either vampire's immortal existence. Alaina woke to find it lying on her kitchen table, the ancient parchment sealed with wax that bore symbols predating written history. The moment her fingers touched the weathered surface, visions flooded her mind with the force of a dam breaking. She saw herself in a life she had never remembered, one that existed in the spaces between the incarnations Kaelan had shown her. A time when she had been not Alaina, the village weaver, but Lyrelay of the northern reaches, a sorceress of considerable power, living in an age when magic flowed openly through the world like rivers of light. In that ancient time, she had known not one immortal lover, but 2. The revelation struck her like physical blow, sending her staggering back from the table, as memories that belonged to a soul far older than her current lifetime crashed through the barriers that had held them hidden. She saw herself standing in a moonlit grove between 2 men who would later become the vampires she now knew as Kaelan and Victor, but who then had been mortal sorcerers competing for her affection and her power. In that long-ago life, she had loved them both. Caelan, then called Calum, had been her devoted protector, patient and kind, willing to wait centuries for her love if necessary. But Victor, who had borne the name Valdris, had been fire to Calum's steady flame, passionate and demanding, offering her adventures and power that her cautious guardian could never provide. The memories came faster now, overwhelming her carefully constructed understanding of her place in their immortal story. She saw herself torn between two different visions of love, the safe devotion that Calum offered and the intoxicating passion that burned in Valdris's eyes. She remembered nights when she had lain in Calum's gentle embrace while dreaming of Valdris's fierce kisses, and days when she had accepted Valdris's gifts of power, while her heart yearned for Calum's steadfast comfort. The scroll in her hands began to glow as she broke the ancient seal, its surface revealing text written in 3 different scripts, her own flowing hand from that distant lifetime, and the bold strokes of both men who had loved her. A supernatural contract written in blood and starlight, binding all 3 souls in ways that transcended mortal death. By moon and star and sacred flame, her ancient handwriting declared, I bind my soul to these 2 who love me, that we 3 might find each other across all the turnings of the wheel. Let death be but a doorway, and let love be the key that opens it. In this life and all lives to come, we are bound by choice and blood and the deep magic that flows beneath all things. Below her words, Calum had signed his agreement in script that already hinted at the ancient wisdom he would carry as Caelan. I pledge my immortal devotion to the woman whose soul calls to mine. In darkness and light, in joy and sorrow, I am hers until the stars grow cold. But it was Victor's contribution that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Where she had expected similar declarations of eternal love, she found instead words of possession and control. I claim what is mine by right of first kiss, first touch, first surrender. Let no other hold what I have marked as my own. She is bound to me, as I am bound to power, and neither bond shall break while I draw breath. The scroll trembled in her hands as she read the final passage, written in a hand she didn't recognize, the spidery script of whatever ancient force had witnessed their binding. 3 souls bound by love and desire, and the hunger for power. But beware, bonds forged in shadow may cast shadows in return. That which is freely given may be forcibly claimed, and love corrupted becomes the cruelest chain of all. You remember now. Victor's voice from behind her sent ice through her veins. She spun to find him standing in her cottage, not at the threshold where supernatural law should have contained him, but fully inside her sanctuary, studying her with satisfaction that spoke of a trap finally sprung. How? She began, but Victor's smile cut off her words. You invited me in yourself, beloved Lyrily, 3 lifetimes ago, when you bound your soul to mine with words written in your own blood. That invitation transcends the petty protections of mortal dwellings. The thornwood staff lay across the room where she had left it, too far to reach before Victor could stop her. The moonstone amulet at her throat had gone cold and dark, its protective power somehow neutralized by the ancient binding she had never known existed. The devoted Calum never told you about our shared past, did he? Victor continued, moving closer with predatory grace. Never mentioned that you once came to my bed willingly, that you once whispered promises of love in my ear while he slept alone in his tower? That's not, Alaina started to deny, but more memories were surfacing now, unbidden and undeniable. She saw herself in Valdris's arms, young and drunk on power and passion, making promises she had been too inexperienced to understand the weight of. She remembered the thrill of his dangerous love, the way he had made her feel like a goddess instead of a mere mortal woman gifted with magic. "You bound yourself to both of us that night," Victor said softly, his voice carrying the hypnotic quality that had once made her forget every rational thought. "But where Kylam accepted the sharing of your affections, I never could. Why should I settle for half a heart when I had touched the whole of your passion?" "Because I was young and foolish and didn't understand what I was promising," Alaina said, finding her voice despite the chaos of recovered memories. "Because people change, even across lifetimes. Because the woman I am now gets to choose who she loves, regardless of what some ancient version of my soul may have agreed to." Victor's laughter held no warmth. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear. The binding we forged was written in the deep magic that underlies all reality. It doesn't care about your current preferences or Kalam's noble devotion. It cares only about the debt of passion you owe me, accumulated across lifetimes when he found you first and stole what should have been mine." The cottage door burst open with such force that it nearly tore from its hinges. Kalan stood silhouetted in the moonlight, his form radiating power that made the very air crackle with tension. But there was something different about him now, a darkness in his expression that she had never seen before. "You told her," he said, his voice carrying centuries of carefully contained rage. "You couldn't simply claim her. You had to make her remember how you corrupted her innocence in that first life." "Corrupted?" Victor laughed again, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "I awakened her to pleasures you were too noble to offer. I showed her what it meant to wield power without the constraints of morality, and she loved every moment of it. Didn't you, Lerale?" The name hit her like a slap, dragging up more memories she wished had stayed buried. She remembered nights when Valdris had taught her to draw power from pain, to bend weaker minds to her will, to revel in the intoxicating rush of dominance over others. She remembered the woman she had been becoming under his influence, someone cruel and beautiful and utterly without compassion. "That's not who I am now," she said firmly, though her voice shook with the weight of recovered shame. "Whatever I may have been in that lifetime, I choose differently now." "Do you?" Kalan asked, and there was hurt in his ancient eyes that cut deeper than any blade. "Because for 7 centuries, I've been searching for the innocent girl I fell in love with, not knowing that she had already been claimed by darkness before I ever touched her heart." The betrayal in his voice broke something inside her chest. Alaina realized that her recovered memories had revealed not just Victor's prior claim on her soul, but the fact that Kalan himself had been living with incomplete knowledge of their shared past. He had spent centuries believing he was her first and only immortal love, never knowing that she had already pledged herself to another. "Both of you have been living lies," she said, her voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized. "Victor, you've been chasing the memory of a woman who chose darkness because she didn't know any better. And Kalan, you've been mourning the loss of someone who was never as pure as you believed. The truth is that none of us are the same people we were in that first lifetime." She moved toward the thornwood staff, surprised when neither vampire moved to stop her. "I may have bound my soul to both of you centuries ago, but I'm not the same woman who made that choice. I've lived and died, and learned and grown through dozens of incarnations. I've been a peasant and a lady, a warrior and a healer, a wife and a widow. Every life has taught me something new about love and loss and the price of power." The staff came alive in her hands, its crystal tip blazing with silver fire that pushed back the shadows gathering in the cottage corners. "So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break this ancient binding, all of it. Not because I don't care for either of you, but because love shouldn't be a chain forged in blood and maintained through supernatural compulsion." "You can't break bonds written in the deep magic," Victor snarled, his handsome mask slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "They are eternal, just as my claim on you is eternal." "Perhaps not break," Alaina admitted, raising the staff until its light filled the cottage with radiance that made both vampires shield their eyes. "But I can choose to rewrite them, and this time the terms will be mine alone." The eclipse crown manifested at midnight, appearing in the center of Thornwick's village square as if summoned by forces far older than human civilization. Alaina felt its arrival like a thunderclap in her bones, the ancient artifact's presence sending shockwaves through the supernatural currents that flowed beneath the ordinary world. She stood at her cottage window, the thornwood staff clutched in white-knuckled hands, watching silvery light pour from the crown's crystalline structure. The artifact hovered 3 feet above the cobblestones, rotating slowly while cosmic energies danced around it in patterns that hurt to look at directly. This was power beyond anything she had imagined, the accumulated force of celestial alignments and magical confluences that occurred perhaps once in a millennium. "The blood moon eclipse approaches," Erasmus Blackthorne said from behind her, his voice heavy with knowledge accumulated across decades of studying forbidden texts. "In 3 nights, when the moon passes through Earth's shadow and celestial forces align in perfect balance, that crown will become the key to rewriting any supernatural bond ever forged." The village elder had arrived an hour after the crown's appearance, carrying with him the ancient grimoire and a collection of artifacts that spoke of preparations made generations in advance. His storm-grey eyes held the weight of prophecy fulfilled and terrible responsibility accepted. "The cost?" Alaina asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Potentially everything," Erasmus replied with characteristic bluntness. "The crown channels cosmic forces that mortal bodies weren't designed to contain. Using it could free you from all supernatural bonds, but it might also destroy you in the process. The deep magic demands balance. To rewrite fate itself requires a sacrifice proportional to the change being made." Kalen materialized from the shadows by her hearth, his immortal features etched with lines of worry that spoke of sleepless nights spent wrestling with impossible choices. Since Victor's revelation about their shared past, something had shifted between them. Not love diminished, but love complicated by truth and the recognition that their relationship had been built on foundations less solid than either had believed. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice carrying centuries of desperate hope. "I won't watch you sacrifice yourself to escape bonds I helped create through my own ignorance." "Your ignorance?" Alaina turned from the window to face him, seeing clearly now the guilt that had been eating at his immortal heart. "You didn't know about Victor's prior claim any more than I did. We were all victims of circumstances, set in motion before we were old enough to understand their consequences." But even as she spoke the words of comfort, Alaina could feel the weight of cosmic forces building toward the coming eclipse. The crown's presence had awakened something in her bloodline that went deeper than her Moonweaver heritage, a connection to the fundamental forces that bound the supernatural world together. She could sense the approach of the blood moon, like a tide gathering strength, and with it came the certainty that the next few days would determine not just her own fate, but the balance between mortal and immortal realms. Victor, for his part, had made no further direct appearances since the night of revelations, but his influence could be felt throughout Thornwick like poison seeping through groundwater. Animals grew restless and fled the village boundaries. Wells that had run clean for generations began to taste of copper and shadow. The very air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if something vast and malevolent was pressing down on the community from beyond the veil of normal perception. "He's gathering power," Kalen observed, his enhanced senses detecting currents invisible to mortal perception, drawing energy from every supernatural source within 50 miles. Whatever he's planning for the eclipse, he intends to overwhelm any resistance through sheer force. Alaina nodded, her own awakened abilities confirming Kalen's assessment. Through her connection to the natural world, she could feel Victor's influence spreading like a disease through the forest ecosystem. Ancient trees that had weathered centuries of storms were beginning to wither. Springs that had bubbled clear since time immemorial ran black with supernatural corruption. Even the stones themselves seemed to cry out in pain as Victor bent the very foundations of reality to serve his will. "He's not just trying to claim me," she realized with growing horror. "He's trying to remake the entire region in his image, to create a domain where his word is absolute law." "A supernatural principality," Erasmus confirmed grimly, "with you as its unwilling queen, and the villagers as subjects bound to his will through the same deep magic that connects your souls. If he succeeds during the eclipse, when the barriers between realms are thinnest, his influence could spread across the entire kingdom within a generation." The magnitude of the threat sent ice through Alaina's veins. This was no longer about choosing between immortal lovers or escaping the bonds of ancient magic. This was about preventing a darkness that could consume everything she had ever loved, transforming her peaceful corner of the world into something from humanity's worst nightmares. Young Henrik arrived at her cottage the next morning, his usually cheerful face pale with fear and exhaustion. The blacksmith's apprentice had always been sensitive to supernatural influences, but now his ability had become a burden that robbed him of sleep and peace. "The dreams are getting worse, Miss Alaina," he said, accepting the cup of tea she offered, with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Every night I see the village burning, but with fires that give off no heat, only shadow. I see people walking the streets with their eyes turned black, moving like puppets on invisible strings, and at the center of it all stands a man who looks like nobility, but feels like winter death." "Victor," Alaina murmured, her heart aching for the boy's terror. "He's been calling to me in the dreams," Henrik continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "telling me to convince the villagers that resistance is useless, that accepting his rule will bring prosperity and protection. But Miss Alaina, when he smiles, I can see the emptiness behind his eyes. Whatever he's offering, it ain't worth the price he'll demand." Through the cottage window, Alaina could see other villagers going about their daily routines, most still unaware of the supernatural forces gathering around their community. Millicent tended her small herb garden with determination that spoke of recovery from her ordeal. Willem guided his flock to pasture with the stoic patience of someone who had weathered many storms. Children played in the square, their laughter a defiant note of innocence against the gathering darkness. These people had become more than neighbors during her years of widowhood. They had become family, the anchors that kept her tethered to hope during the loneliest nights. The thought of Victor's corruption touching them, transforming them into shadows of themselves, filled her with rage that burned brighter than any magical fire. "I need to speak with everyone," she said, decision crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on still water. If we're going to face what's coming, they deserve to know the truth about what threatens them. The village meeting that evening filled the square with more people than had gathered since the last harvest festival. Alaina stood before them with the thornwood staff in her hands and the moonstone amulet blazing at her throat, no longer hiding the supernatural radiance that marked her as something more than human. She told them everything, her true heritage as the last of the Moonweaver bloodline, the ancient bonds that tied her to immortal forces, and the choice that lay before them all as the eclipse approached. Some villagers listened with the wide-eyed wonder of children hearing fairy tales, while others displayed the grim acceptance of people who had always suspected that the world held more mystery than their daily lives revealed. "So we have 3 choices," she concluded, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "We can flee, abandoning our homes, and hoping to escape Victor's influence before it spreads beyond these borders. We can submit, accepting his rule and praying that his promises of protection outweigh the cost to our souls. Or we can stand and fight, knowing that victory may require sacrifices none of us are prepared to make." The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Willem the shepherd stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of determined resolve. "My family's tended flocks in these meadows for 8 generations, he said, his voice carrying the authority of deep roots and unshakable conviction. "I won't be the one to break that chain, not for all the immortal threats in creation. If you're staying to fight, Miss Alaina, then you'll have my shepherd's crook and whatever courage these old bones can muster." One by one, other villagers voiced their support. Millicent with her fierce maternal protectiveness, Henrik with the bright courage of youth facing its first real test. Even the village priest, who blessed their cause while privately wrestling with theological implications that would take him years to fully understand. Not everyone chose to stay. Several families departed before dawn, carrying what possessions they could manage and leaving behind tearful farewells. Alaina didn't blame them for seeking safety elsewhere. What was coming would test the limits of human endurance and supernatural power alike. As the final night before the eclipse settled over Thornwick, Alaina stood once more at her cottage window, watching the eclipse crown pulse with increasing intensity in the village square. Cosmic forces were building toward a crescendo that would reshape the supernatural landscape, and at the center of it all stood a village weaver who had discovered she carried the power to rewrite the very foundations of magical law. Kaelin appeared beside her, solid and reassuring despite the uncertainty that clouded their future together. "Whatever happens tomorrow night," he said softly, "know that loving you in every lifetime, in every incarnation, has been the greatest privilege an immortal heart could ask for." Alaina leaned into his strength, drawing comfort from his presence while her mind raced through final preparations and contingency plans. In a few hours, the blood moon would rise, the eclipse crown would reach full power, and she would face a choice that would echo through eternity. The last of the Moonweaver bloodline was ready to weave a new pattern into the fabric of destiny itself. The blood moon rose like a crimson eye, opening in the star-scattered darkness, its otherworldly light painting Thornwick village in shades of copper and shadow. Alaina stood in the center of the square, the eclipse crown floating 3 feet above her outstretched palms, while cosmic energies crackled through the air like visible lightning. The thornwood staff lay across her shoulders, its crystal tip blazing with power that resonated in harmony with the celestial forces gathering overhead. The blood moon chalice had materialized at the moment of eclipse totality, appearing on the ancient stone altar that Erasmus had revealed beneath the village well. The mystical vessel was carved from some dark material that seemed to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it, its surface inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. According to the grimoire's ancient text, the chalice would channel the eclipse's power, but only if filled with a willing sacrifice given in the name of love rather than conquest. "You feel it too," Victor said, stepping from the shadows at the square's edge with supernatural grace. The eclipse had transformed him, revealing the full extent of his immortal power now that celestial forces weakened the barriers between realms. His pale skin glowed with inner fire, and his eyes had become wells of darkness that reflected the blood moon's crimson light. The moment when destiny can be rewritten, when the bonds that have held us for centuries can be broken or strengthened beyond all possibility of escape. Around the square's perimeter, the villagers who had chosen to stay watched with a mixture of awe and terror. They formed a protective circle around the ritual space, their combined faith and determination creating a barrier that even Victor's enhanced power couldn't easily breach. In their hands, they held simple weapons, shepherd's crooks, kitchen knives, tools transformed into instruments of resistance by the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary darkness. "The chalice requires sacrifice," Victor continued, his voice carrying hypnotic undertones that spoke directly to the ancient binding between their souls. "But not the sacrifice you imagine, my dear Lyrelay. Not your life or your power, but your freedom to choose. Fill the chalice with your willing submission, and I will spare your precious villagers the pain of resisting what they cannot defeat." Kalen materialized between them, his own immortal power blazing in response to Victor's challenge. The two vampires faced each other across the ritual space, while supernatural forces crackled in the air around them, centuries of friendship and rivalry finally coming to its destined conclusion. "She has already chosen," Kalen said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to love without possession. "Not me, not you, but freedom itself. The bonds we forged in ignorance will be broken tonight, regardless of the cost." Victor's laughter was sharp as breaking glass. "Broken? Oh, my noble friend, you still understand so little about the deep magic that binds us. Those bonds cannot be broken, only transferred. When the eclipse reaches its peak, one of us will claim absolute dominion over her soul, while the other will be cast into oblivion. The chalice demands willing sacrifice. True enough. But the sacrifice it craves is not Lyrelay's submission. It's the voluntary destruction of whichever rival loves her less." The words hit Alaina like physical blows, revealing a truth that the ancient texts had hidden beneath layers of mystical language. The eclipse crown pulsed brighter in response to her shock, its cosmic energies responding to the sudden spike in her emotional state. "No," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "The ritual wasn't designed to free me. It was designed to eliminate competition between supernatural rivals. Winner takes all, loser faces complete annihilation." "Precisely," Victor said, his smile holding centuries of patient planning. "And I have already decided which of us loves you enough to make that sacrifice." Before anyone could react, Victor moved with speed that turned him into a blur of shadow and moonlight. But instead of attacking Kalen or reaching for Alaina, he grasped the blood moon chalice and raised it above his head like an offering to the crimson moon overhead. "I, Victor of the Winter Courts, willingly offer my immortal essence to break the bonds that bind Lyrelay of the Moonweavers," he declared, his voice echoing with the weight of cosmic law, recognizing a valid sacrifice. Let my love prove itself in the giving of all I am, that she might be free to choose her own destiny without the chains of ancient magic compelling her choice. The chalice blazed with light that outshone the blood moon itself as Victor's declaration activated forces older than civilization. Tendrils of silver fire began to flow from his body into the mystical vessel, carrying with them the essence of his immortal existence. "Victor, don't!" Alaina started forward, but the Eclipse Crown's power held her frozen in the ritual circle, cosmic forces demanding that the sacrifice be completed without interference. "This is not redemption," Victor said, his form already beginning to fade as his life force poured into the chalice. "This is love finally learning the difference between possession and devotion. I have claimed you across lifetimes, but I have never truly loved you until this moment when I choose to let you go." His eyes found hers across the blazing ritual space, and for the first time in centuries, she saw not the calculating predator who had pursued her through multiple incarnations, but the young man named Valdris, who had loved her with passionate sincerity before power and immortality had corrupted his heart. "Be free, my beloved," he whispered as the last of his essence flowed into the chalice. "Be free and be happy." The chalice erupted with light that turned the blood moon silver, sending shock waves of released energy rippling outward from Thornwick Village in expanding circles that would be felt by every supernatural creature within 100 miles. The explosion of released energy from Victor's sacrifice sent Alaina tumbling through visions of every life she had ever lived, every death she had endured, every moment of love and loss that had shaped her immortal soul across the centuries. She saw herself as the peasant girl who had died of plague, while Kaelin wept over her still form. She relived the Renaissance lady's fall from the tower window, the Victorian maiden's consumption, the frontier woman's violent end, all the tragic conclusions that had defined their endless cycle of reunion and separation. But this time, something was different. Instead of the inevitable march toward death and rebirth, she found herself standing in a space between worlds, a realm of silver mist and starlight, where the rules of mortality held no sway. Before her floated a crystal of impossible beauty, the Phoenix Tear, formed from the intersection of Victor's willing sacrifice and the cosmic forces of the blood moon eclipse. The Phoenix Tear pulsed with light that contained every color that had ever existed, and several that belonged to no earthly spectrum. Within its crystalline depths, she could see the power to rewrite not just supernatural bonds, but the very nature of existence itself. This was the true gift that Victor's sacrifice had created, not just her freedom from ancient magic, but the ability to choose what form that freedom would take. Lyrily, Kaelin's voice reached her across the mystical space, and she turned to see him approaching through the silver mist. But he looked different now, younger somehow, as if Victor's sacrifice had begun to strip away the accumulated weight of his immortal years. "The bonds are breaking," he said, reaching out to touch her face, with fingers that trembled with mortality's fragility. Victor's sacrifice shattered the deep magic that held us, but the cosmic forces demand balance. The Phoenix Tear can restore you to life, but only if someone willingly takes on the mortality you've shed. Understanding flooded through her like sunrise after the longest night. The eclipse ritual hadn't just been about eliminating supernatural rivals. It had been about offering choices that transcended the original binding. Victor had chosen to sacrifice his existence for her freedom. Now Kaelin was offering to sacrifice his immortality for her life. "You would give up eternity?" she whispered, her heart breaking at the magnitude of what he was offering. You would become mortal, knowing that it means you'll age and die while I continue to be reborn. Kaelin's smile held all the tenderness that had sustained him through centuries of searching. I have had eternity, my beloved. I have walked through civilizations and watched empires rise and fall. But in all those endless years, the only moments that truly mattered were the ones I spent loving you. If I can have one complete lifetime, one full span of years to love you, without the shadow of supernatural compulsion or ancient bonds, then mortality is a gift beyond price. The phoenix tear responded to his words, beginning to glow brighter as cosmic forces prepared to honor his choice. But before the transformation could begin, Alaina reached out to grasp the crystal herself, feeling its power flow through her with warmth that reached to the deepest places in her soul. "Then we choose together," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally learned to shape her own destiny. "Not your mortality alone, but our shared humanity. Let the phoenix tear break every supernatural bond that has ever constrained our love, and let us both be reborn into lives we can live by choice rather than mystical compulsion." The crystal blazed with light that transformed the mystical realm around them, reality reshaping itself in response to their combined will. Alaina felt the accumulated power of her Moonweaver bloodline flowing out of her and into the phoenix tear, freely given rather than forcibly taken. Beside her, Kaelin's immortal essence merged with hers, their souls intertwining not through ancient magic, but through the simple, profound miracle of freely chosen love. The transformation was gentler than she had expected, like sinking into warm water after a lifetime of carrying impossible weight. The supernatural senses that had awakened during her time with Kaelin faded to whispers, leaving her with just enough awareness to sense the natural world without being overwhelmed by its mystical currents. The power that had marked her as something more than human settled into quiet potential, magic that could be called upon in great need, but would no longer define every moment of her existence. When the silver mist cleared, they were standing once again in Thornwick's village square. But the world around them had subtly changed. The blood moon had returned to its normal silver radiance, and the eclipse crown was slowly dissolving into motes of starlight that drifted away on the night breeze. The villagers who had witnessed the ritual were stirring from the trance-like state that had held them during the cosmic working, blinking in confusion as supernatural influences released their hold. Kaelin stood beside her, solid and real and beautifully, perfectly mortal. His dark hair showed the first threads of silver, and lines of character had appeared around his eyes, the gentle marks of someone learning to exist within time's constraints rather than outside them. When he smiled at her, it was with the wonder of someone experiencing sunrise for the first time. "We're free," he said simply, taking her hand with fingers that were warm and completely, wonderfully human. The phoenix tear's final gift manifested as understanding that flowed between them without need for words. They would have one lifetime together, perhaps 50 years if they were fortunate, maybe only 30 if fate proved unkind. But those years would be theirs by choice, unmarked by supernatural compulsion or the weight of ancient promises made by souls too young to understand their consequences. Around them, Thornwick Village was awakening to a new day, freed from Victor's corrupting influence and protected by the lingering echoes of the phoenix tear's power. The people they loved would live and laugh and face ordinary human challenges without the shadow of supernatural threat darkening their days. It was, Alaina realized, as Kaelin's arms wrapped around her in the growing dawn light, exactly what she had dreamed of without knowing she was dreaming. A chance to love and be loved without the weight of destiny pressing down upon them like a stone. 6 months after the blood moon eclipse, Alaina stood at her loom in the cottage that had become a home in ways it had never been before. The morning light streaming through the diamond-paned windows fell across threads that shimmered with subtle magic. Not the overwhelming power that had once marked her as something beyond human understanding, but a gentle enhancement that spoke of protection given freely rather than wielded by force. The tapestry taking shape beneath her fingers was unlike anything she had created before. Where her previous work had depicted the simple beauties of village life or the commissioned scenes requested by neighbors, this new weaving told the story of their supernatural journey. But it was not the dark tale of ancient bonds and immortal obsession that an outside observer might expect. Instead, it glowed with warmth and hope, showing the transformation of 3 souls from the chains of mystical compulsion to the freedom of chosen love. In one corner of the tapestry, she had woven Victor's final moment, not as the predator he had been for centuries, but as the young man named Valdris, who had learned the difference between possession and devotion in time to make the ultimate sacrifice. The threads that depicted his dissolution into silver light carried no sorrow, only the peaceful resolution of a soul finally at rest. The central panel showed the Phoenix Tear's moment of creation, when cosmic forces and willing sacrifice had combined to offer choices that transcended the limitations of ancient magic. But it was the tapestry's final section that brought tears to her eyes every time she worked on it. Kaelan as he was now, mortal and aging and beautiful in his humanity, standing beside her mortal self in the cottage that had sheltered generations of her family. "Still can't quite believe it's real?" Kaelan asked from the kitchen, where he was preparing the simple breakfast that had become their morning ritual. His voice carried the contentment of someone who had found in ordinary moments the fulfillment that had eluded him across centuries of supernatural existence. "Some mornings I wake up expecting to find you gone," Alaina admitted, setting down her shuttle to turn toward him. "Expecting this to be just another dream that will dissolve when I try to hold on to it too tightly." Kaelan crossed the cottage with steps that were no longer supernatural in their grace, but remained elegant in their deliberate care. At 51 to her 43, he moved with the measured confidence of someone learning to inhabit a body that would age and change rather than remain forever frozen in immortal perfection. The silver in his dark hair caught the morning light, and the lines around his eyes spoke of laughter shared and worries overcome together. "Then let me remind you," he said softly, taking her hands in his calloused ones. 6 months of mortal living had marked him with the honest wear of someone who chopped wood and tended gardens and helped neighbors with the everyday tasks that had once been beneath the notice of an immortal being. "We are real, this love is real, and we have earned every moment of peace we've found." The village beyond their cottage windows had settled into a new rhythm in the months since the eclipse. The supernatural threats that had plagued Thornwick were gone, driven away by the protective magic that still flowed from Alaina's transformed bloodline. But more importantly, the community had discovered a strength in unity that transcended any mystical protection. Millicent had recovered fully from her ordeal and had taken to visiting daily with fresh bread and gentle gossip that kept them connected to village life. Young Henrik had apprenticed himself not only to the blacksmith, but to Erasmus Blackthorn, learning to recognize and guard against supernatural threats that might someday return to test their peaceful existence. Willem's flocks grazed contentedly in meadows cleansed of Victor's corruption, and the village priest had incorporated prayers of thanksgiving for mysteries beyond human understanding into his regular services. The most visible change was the new tradition that had grown up around the site where the eclipse crown had manifested. The villagers had built a simple stone monument there, not to commemorate supernatural power, but to honor the choices made in love's name. Children played around it without fear, and travelers passing through Thornwick often commented on the sense of deep peace that seemed to emanate from the village square. The Ashworth family sent word, Caelan said, returning to his breakfast preparations with the domestic competence that still amazed Alaina daily. Their daughter has accepted our invitation to the wedding. She'll be arriving next week with her husband and the baby. The wedding. After months of quiet courtship, unmarked by supernatural compulsion or ancient destiny, they had decided to formalize their union in the most human way possible, with vows spoken before their community, promises made not because cosmic forces demanded them, but because their hearts had chosen freely. It would be a simple ceremony, held in the village square, where they had faced their greatest trial and emerged victorious, not through power, but through love. Erasmus would officiate, using words drawn from traditions older than Christianity, but sanctified by the genuine devotion of two souls who had learned the difference between mystical binding and freely given commitment. "I've been thinking about children," Alaina said quietly, her hands returning to the loom, where threads of silver and gold awaited her touch. "Not because the Moonweaver bloodline needs to continue, but because I think we might have something beautiful to pass on to the next generation." Caelan's smile was radiant with possibilities they had never dared to imagine during their supernatural incarnations. Children who will grow up knowing that love is a choice, not a compulsion. Who will understand that true strength comes from protecting others rather than dominating them. The new tapestry continued to grow beneath her fingers as they talked, its threads weaving themselves into patterns that told not of ancient powers or immortal obsessions, but of the quiet miracles that filled ordinary days. Morning tea shared in companionable silence, evening walks through meadows unmarked by supernatural corruption, nights spent in each other's arms without the shadow of inevitable loss darkening their peace. At the tapestry's border, Alaina began to weave a new pattern, one that showed not the past or present, but the future they were building together. Children playing in cottage gardens, grandparents sharing stories by winter fires. The endless cycle of human life lived with purpose and joy, and the knowledge that every moment was precious precisely because it would not last forever. "No more reincarnations," she murmured, her voice carrying the wonder of someone finally free from cycles that had defined existence for centuries. No more searching across lifetimes for love that was always meant to be freely chosen rather than mystically compelled. "Just this," Caelan agreed, settling beside her to watch the tapestry grow. "One lifetime, lived fully, loved completely, and shared with someone whose choice to love me is renewed every morning when she wakes up and chooses to stay." As the sun climbed higher over Thornwick village, painting their cottage in shades of gold and promise, Alaina continued to weave their story into threads that would survive long after their mortal forms had returned to earth. It was a tapestry that spoke not of supernatural power or immortal obsession, but of the greatest magic of all, two souls choosing each other freely, again and again, in the endless succession of ordinary days that make up a life well lived. The cottage that had sheltered generations of Moonweaver women now held something new, not the last keeper of an ancient bloodline, but the first generation of a family built on choice rather than destiny, love rather than compulsion, hope rather than the weight of supernatural obligation. Outside their windows, Thornwick Village went about its peaceful business, protected not by overwhelming power, but by the quiet strength of a community that had learned to stand together against darkness. And at the heart of it all, two former immortals discovered daily that mortality's greatest gift was not its brevity, but its freedom to choose how each precious moment would be spent. The weaving continued, threads of silver and gold and deep forest green, creating patterns that would endure long after the hands that shaped them had returned to dust. It was, Alaina thought, as Kaelin's mortal warmth settled beside her, the most beautiful story she had ever had the privilege to tell.